So, welcome to another edition of the Spoken Review. And today we are going to talk a bit about Life Everlasting, The Animal Way of Death by Bernd Heinrich. Now, before I talk about this book, I want to say a few words about Bernd Heinrich, who is a very interesting man. He came from Germany to the United States as a very young man, uh, at the end of high school, I believe. And then he actually became quite a famous runner, and in fact set a few records in the long distance running categories of the 50 mile and the 100-mile marathons and super marathons. And so this led him to explore the outdoors and become a lover of the outdoors. He built a cabin in Maine where he has lived for most of his time over the last couple of decades. And what makes him special is really that he is one of the very few field biologists in the grand tradition of Charles Darwin. He is one of those very few people who have truly excelled at getting down on their hands and knees, living out there in the woods like Thoreau, gathering, studying, collecting, dissecting, capturing, releasing different kinds of animals and insects and plants. I think even more than E.O. Wilson, who passed away recently and who was, of course, famous as a field biologist of renown, in addition to being a great writer. Bernd Heinrich is the real deal. He really spends all his time outdoors, and reading anything that he has written is really reading a high chronicle of living outdoors and studying nature. Now that brings me to his books. He is an astonishingly prolific writer. He has written, um, I would say, at least 15 or 20 different books on various aspects of natural history. His most famous book is probably a book called The Raven in Winter, which is a fascinating study of ravens and their habits, and especially their habits of eating dead animals. So he kind of picks up on this theme in this book, Life Everlasting. And it's really about the way different animals process death. And when I say process, I don't mean emotionally, although some of them may do, we don't really know that. But it's really just the physical act and the ingenious strategies that different animals, ranging from beetles through mammals like hyenas, through birds, all the way through whales, as well as really simple but remarkable organisms like fungi and bacteria. Um, all the strategies that these different creatures use for getting rid of their fellow dead animals in nature. Now, this might seem like a very morbid topic. Typically, when we come across a dead animal in nature, roadkill, for instance, or a large carcass in a forest or by the side of the highway, always fills us with a sense of disgust and revulsion, especially when we see maggots eating the dead animal, for instance. But as Heinrich shows us, hopefully this book will provide a corrective to our reaction when we come across a dead animal in nature, because really the act of consuming a dead animal is not just one of the most efficient acts that nature can perform, but it's also one of the most creative acts that nature can perform. If you look at what happens to a dead animal, and you can try this yourself actually. If you ever come across a dead animal, a small dead animal, keep it outside on the side of a highway and see what happens, and just observe the sheer efficiency with which all that organic matter, including some pretty tough to digest organic matter like cartilage and bones and so on, is really broken down by efficient recyclers in the environment, starting from the top of the food chain, which might consist of large carnivores, and then going down the food chain to birds and smaller mammals, all the way down to invisible scavengers like bacteria and fungi. And in many ways, this book is really about the scavengers of the world. Um, and it again dispels a lot of the feelings that we might have about typically about scavengers like hyenas and vultures, regarding them as these sort of grim, repulsive animals. But what he's trying to show in this book is that they're anything but repulsive. They're actually great contributors to the environment. They are great recyclers. Without these scavengers, a lot of dead animals and a lot of dead tissue and a dead organic matter would be spread all over the planet. There would be no way to get rid of it in a natural way, and we would have a huge problem on our hands. So all of these scavengers are really helping us out a lot. So, the book is kind of a combination of what we can call grand evolutionary theories that explain certain kinds of scavenging and hunting, along with a lot of personal memoirs. This is pretty much standard for most of Bernd Heinrich's books. He starts with a letter from a friend, which sounds morbid, but which is actually very thought provoking. It's a friend who is suffering from a severe illness, and he thinks that he's going to die much sooner than he thought. And instead of being cremated or buried, which are the two traditional ways that humans dispose of their dead bodies, um, he's wondering if he can bury himself on private property instead of in a grave or in a cemetery. And then he says, "You can probably guess what's coming. What are your thoughts on having an old friend as a permanent resident at the camp? I feel great at the moment, never better in my life, in fact, but it's always later than you think." So this was a letter that led Bernd Heinrich to think at length about human death, and that obviously led him to think a lot about animal death in general, animal death that he had observed a lot while camping out in his cabin in Maine. And so he leads us through a fascinating journey, and it really starts with um, necrophorus beetles. So these are beetles that seem to mirror the human ritual of burying their dead, not as any kind of ritualistic ceremonial thing, but just purely from a selfish biological standpoint. So these fascinating little creatures, what they do is whenever they find a dead animal, a small dead animal like a dead mouse or a dead squirrel, the males will effectively dance around the dead animal and perform a mating dance. And they'll send out signals that will attract females to them. And when the females come to the dead animal, the two will mate. And then, in a very efficient act, they would actually bury the dead animal. They would have the dead animal curl up as a ball, and then they would cover it up with a lot of dirt. And after this is done, the female lays her eggs near the dead animal. And when the eggs hatch, the youngs actually feed on all the plentiful nutrition that is provided by the dead animal. So this is just one among many very interesting ways in which small animals are processed, if you will, by beetles. And beetles, in fact, just as a group of animals, are extremely efficient um, at at burying dead animals and at consuming them. And of course, true to his nature, Heinrich then does some experiments where he actually buries his own animals in the backyard. Everything ranging from small squirrels and rabbits all the way to deer that he has either hunted or that he has found in the woods. And then he looks at what these beetles do and reports it all really well. Um, the second or third chapter directly talks about human beings, and this is immensely interesting. So, one of the questions that always comes up when we talk about human evolution is whether early man, prehistoric man, was primarily a scavenger or primarily a hunter. And this is the discussion that Heinrich really leads us into. And his conclusion is that scavenging would have been very difficult for prehistoric man. A prehistoric man did not have a lot of great tools and weapons to fight off large predators. He was living in an environment that was rife with carnivorous predators, cheetahs and leopards and lions and all the other animals that populate the African savanna. So competing with those animals to essentially get a share of a dead animal, a dead carcass, would have been exceedingly dangerous. There's no doubt about that. One of the problems with that, and one reason why it's dangerous and difficult, is because dead animals have to be consumed very quickly. Otherwise, they start decomposing, and anyone who eats a dead animal can get very sick indeed, and in fact die. And some of you might remember this is what happened with that unfortunate young man in the movie Into the Wild. He actually eats rotten meat because he hasn't learned how to process and eat fresh meat, and that's why he dies. And so Native Americans, in fact, were extremely efficient. Now, this was, of course, much later in the process of human evolution, but Native Americans were extremely efficient in disposing of a freshly dead animal by eating it. And so some of them indulged in practices that today we might find rather repulsive, in the sense of eating the liver, eating the heart, eating the brain raw right after the animal had died. Uh, but the thing to remember again is that they were actually being extremely efficient and extremely smart in consuming these dead animals right after they died. But going back to our example of prehistoric human beings, that would have been very hard to do for a prehistoric man out on the savannah. Native Americans, after all, did have some pretty advanced weapons and tools with which they could fight off predators. Prehistoric man did not have these weapons. And so the only recourse that was left to prehistoric man was to hunt rather than scavenge. And this led to a lot of very important evolutionary innovations, including bipedalism, including hunting in groups. Hunting in groups was probably a path breaking, a seminal evolutionary innovation, because it led to social exchange of ideas. It led to the development of bigger brains because you had to keep track of who all you were hunting with. And of course, it was a very efficient strategy for tiring out large animals over long distances and then killing them and eating them. So there's a lot of very interesting discussion that Heinrich has about how early man was not really a scavenger, but mostly a hunter. Now, one small digression, I just want to point out that this book has some very beautiful illustrations. A lot of them, not surprisingly, are of beetles. So here's one of them. These are again beetles that are scavengers that do a great job of disposing of dead animals. I'm just trying to find some more. Here's another one. These are gigantic uh, carcass scavenging beetles that he found under a carcass. And so Heinrich himself is a very good artist, as can be seen from these illustrations. So in addition to being a top-notch field biologist, top-notch runner, and top-notch writer, somehow he manages also to be a great artist. But the book is certainly enlivened by some of these illustrations. In fact, here's another one that I found, which might be familiar to some of you who know about dung beetles. Now, these are again fascinating creatures, and he has a chapter on how dung beetles make such efficient use even of the most degraded material, which is dung, which you would not expect would come in handy, but they do. There's other chapters on larger scavengers like vultures and hyenas, and how their social behavior also compelled them to act and hunt in packs and make quick work of any animal that had died. There's also a great chapter on microorganisms, because in many ways they are the biggest scavengers of the world. So bacteria and fungi account for most of the scavenging that is done of dead organic matter, and they're superb, absolutely superb at recycling the elements in organic matter and giving it back to the environment. Dead trees make a very important appearance in this whole cycle of life and death. There's a wonderful chapter that Heinrich has where he talks about how dead trees sustain an amazingly diverse ecosystem of scavengers and animals, everything from worms and maggots to woodpeckers drilling holes in dead trees, all the way down to, again, extensive networks of fungi that process dead trees. I don't need to remind readers that fungi, in fact, can spread through their mycelia, sometimes over miles. In many ways, they are a super organism. They are the most diverse and most interesting and spread out organism on the surface of the earth. And fungi, as we well know, will grow on almost anything. I remember some oyster mushrooms that I had ordered from Amazon a couple of months back, and I could grow them on almost any kind of garbage, ranging from cardboard to coffee grounds to banana peels, even to dry wood chips. So fungi are incredibly efficient at making quick work of pretty much any kind of organic matter. It doesn't matter what it is. After going through these different types of animals and plants and microorganisms and fungi and talking about the amazing way in which they process the dead, Heinrich finally comes to human beings and the way we process our dead. And I think it goes without saying that compared to all of these other creatures, we are pitifully inefficient in disposing of our dead animals. In fact, I was just remembering how relevant this book is when I encountered a recent episode of The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. I think it's the one that came out 2 or 3 days ago, maybe, where he talks about the problems with human burial and human cremation. The sheer the sheer amount of resources, the sheer number of resources that are needed to cremate a dead body or bury a dead body are immense. It's an extremely inefficient, extremely energy intensive process, needing a lot of fossil fuels, for instance, in the case of cremation. And it's really not the way to do it if you care about nature and care about the environment. And this is, of course, not even accounting for the fact that burials are increasingly taking up a huge amount of space. In fact, one amusing fact that I would point out in this regard is that I live only a few miles away from a town called Colma, which is the cemetery capital of the world. So the dead in Colma outnumber the living by a factor of 10 or 50 or maybe even 100. I don't remember the exact number, but certainly by a large number. And so we don't want to keep on using natural resources for these kinds of inefficient burials. And so, even as the Daily Show points out, but Heinrich certainly points out, what's a better way to do it? And a better way is to indulge in what we can call green burials. So this might include burial at sea, where fishes and other marine animals can consume of your body. In fact, Heinrich has a fascinating chapter about how whale bodies are consumed over a very long period of time by tube worms and bacteria and other creatures. I mean, imagine the whale, which is clearly the largest animal that ever lived on Earth. Imagine a whale being consumed when it dies and sinks to the bottom of the ocean, how long that's going to take. But even that is done very efficiently by all these microorganisms and so-called lower organisms like tube worms. So that's certainly one way to dispose of a dead body. The other way, and one which I favor, I think it's absolutely wonderful, is to ensure that the dead body turns into fertilizer for a living tree. What better way to give back to the environment than having the corporeal form that you're made of make its way back into nature just the way it came. All the elements that you're made of now are dispersed into nature. They are being used efficiently by all the creatures and plants of nature. I can't think of a better way to dispose of our dead. At the end of the book, Heinrich asks a very poignant question, and in many ways, that single question really jumped out at me. That was the one thing that really jumped out at me from the book. He says that every year, we human beings consume billions of animals uh, in the form of, beef and chicken and pork and so on, and yet we seem to love denying ourselves to even a single creature on the planet after we die. So, what gives us the right to consume billions of animals every year in our diet and still not allow at least a few hundred different species to consume us in turn? That seems like an incredibly skewed balance. That seems like an incredibly selfish and unfair act on our part. And I can't agree with him more. Human beings are not separate from nature, they are of the environment, they're part of the same raw material that all other animals and plants come from. As Darwin reminded us in his great work, we are derived from those animals. They preceded us. They have as much or more claim on this planet as we do. And so the least that we can do after we die is make sure that we again become part of the same grand ecosystem of nature that gave rise to us. Truly, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, element to element. Read this book. I think it'll be quite eye opening. Bernd Heinrich, Life Everlasting, The Animal Way of Death.